Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Adam Lang. Everywhere you look in Australia at the moment, businesses are coping differently. Some states, like Western Australia and Tasmania, have made it through the recent COVID outbreaks relatively unscathed. Victoria and South Australia have now emerged from their lockdowns, though for Victoria, it's becoming a familiar process. Queensland is just entering another lockdown, and in New South Wales, Sydney remains in the grip of a COVID outbreak, with businesses in hibernation and many struggling to stay afloat. There's been a lot of talk about the government support on offer, both state and federal, but there also needs to be a realistic, detailed plan for what happens after a lockdown, how businesses can be supported to get back on their feet. Andrew Hunter is the Chief Executive Officer of CPA Australia. He's proposed a 5-point plan to support small to medium-sized enterprises post-lockdown. He's also got an insight into what it's really like for these businesses right now. Andrew, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be back.
It's hard to talk broadly about post-lockdown recovery when different states are at different stages, but at some point we've all been through or are still going through lockdowns, so I think we understand the challenges. Can you take me through the 5 key points that you've identified? And if I start at the first one, you've recommended tapered support for small to medium-sized enterprises.
That's right, Adam, and we think that's probably the most important of our 5-point plan. And the key point we want to make here is the pain doesn't end for small business when the lockdown ends. So businesses don't get a lot of notice when they are about to go into a lockdown. In fact, we're talking days, not weeks. And unfortunately, the last lockdown in Victoria is very fresh in my mind. And I do recall that businesses really only got 2 or 3 days notice. And that is incredibly challenging for them from a cash flow perspective. So they assume they're going to be open for business. They've built up inventory, they've got all of their labour on board, and all of a sudden, at very short notice, their business goes into lockdown. Now, there have been good support packages in place from the Commonwealth and the state governments in Victoria and also in New South Wales in particular. And I'll talk a little bit more. I think those packages are doing what they are intended to do. But the problem is cash flow does not return immediately that a lockdown ends. So businesses need to build inventories back up again. They've probably had to get rid of some inventory. And we know for restaurants, a lot of their inventory is perishable. And so when our world returns from lockdown, and I was one of the few people who decided to go back into the office on Wednesday, what I noticed is there's not many people about. So businesses and activity does not return immediately. You look at even rural locations in Victoria and New South Wales, and this is really the first time we've seen the damage flow through into regional locations. If you cancelled a holiday because of a lockdown, you don't rebook it immediately. You often take weeks to rebook your vacation. And so what we're suggesting is that the Commonwealth government and state governments, when you come out of lockdown, should taper the support that they have for SMEs. So let's maybe in the first week extend it at the same level. In the second week, reduce it by half. In the third week, by half again. And that'll give businesses the opportunity to rebuild their cash flow and get back on their feet.
That makes a lot of sense. The second point that you've identified, the deferral of Commonwealth and state revenue collection. Talk a little bit about that one.
Well, what we've identified in the conversations that we've had with our public practitioners is the biggest challenge for small businesses is simply liquidity. So what they're looking for is survival. And I think the Commonwealth and the state and territory governments are very sensitive to this. The last thing a small business owner needs when they come out of lockdown is to get a notice in the mail to say, you've got a sum of money due. We're saying defer it. We're not saying write it off or eliminate it, but we're saying give our small businesses some breathing space. They're struggling with funding at the moment. Their biggest challenge is liquidity. And small businesses, we know, struggle with access to finance. Big businesses have different options for liquidity. Small businesses who are struggling to survive can't just turn up to their bank and say, I'm about to go under, can you give me $50,000? That's not a great conversation to have with your bank.
It's so true. I think for any business struggling with the ramifications of lockdowns, cash flow is always an issue, but at times like this, more cash seems to be going out than coming in. And I think just that mental well-being around that is an important point on its own.
Look, I think that's a critical point, Adam. I remember going to my favourite restaurant, and I always like to support these guys, and I know the owner very well. I've been going there for 10 years, and I could see just from the look on his face how much pain he had gone through during that period of lockdown, you know, the mental anguish. And again, the pain doesn't go away when you come out of lockdown. So the support for these people and their mental health is just incredibly important.
Completely agree. The third point you've identified is a moratorium on Commonwealth compliance activity. Can you please talk a little bit more about that one?
Yeah, look, it's similar to the deferral of the Commonwealth and state and territory revenue collection. And we know the ATO are cognizant of this, and fortunately we do have lines into the ATO. We're having a great dialogue with them. We think the ATO should be putting a pause on debt collection. And I have seen through experience talking to our public practitioners that the ATO are doing a terrific job here. If you miss your deadline for a particular instalment, a PAYG instalment or a BAS instalment, the ATO, they do get in touch with you, but it's a good conversation, not a bad conversation. It's not a where is our money? It's a helpful conversation to say, how can we help you and how can we work out a plan for you to pay the debts that are due?
So the fourth point you've identified is consumer incentives. This is an excellent suggestion. And what are some of the incentives you're thinking about?
Well, the City of Melbourne had a terrific one that I think they announced when we came out of our most recent lockdown, as opposed to the one we've just come out of, where they had a dining voucher program where you could get 20% off if you went and dined in a city restaurant. They allocated $8.4 million. It was exhausted within probably about 8 weeks. And my suggestion is that they relaunch that. But I would do it a little bit differently. So I went out last night for dinner in the city and deliberately chose to go out in the city because I wanted to support restaurants in the city, and I took one of my sons with me. And look, I was happy to support. I'm not looking for the 20% discount, but what I would say is we want to get people back into our city restaurants as quickly as possible. So rather than leaving this incentive package on the table for 8 weeks, what small businesses need is cash flow and cash flow quickly. So let's leave that package on the table for 3 weeks instead of 8 weeks, and let's get our city restaurants to the capacity limit that they're allowed to operate at. Similar thing for travel and accommodation. So we would be keen to see people start to rebook their holidays into, I'm a Victorian, so I'd encourage people to go on holidays in regional Victoria. And I think those accommodation vouchers, again, don't leave them open for too long. We want to see activity pick up rapidly. And the way you do that is by putting a deadline on some of these consumer incentives. They're really important.
Almost like helping to hit the reset button in a way.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
The fifth point you've made is financial assistance for businesses seeking advice. Can you please talk to that one as well?
Well, we see a correlation between businesses that seek advice and those that thrive. And it's not just about going to see your professional accountant about how to access capital. It's also things like how to digitise your business. And you recall when you and I spoke last time on Fear and Greed, Adam, we just completed a survey of SMEs in the Asia Pacific region.
And innovation in particular.
Yeah, that's right. And unfortunately, Australian small businesses picked up the wooden spoon for the least likely to embrace digital innovation in their businesses. Now, that has started to change, which is terrific, but people need to go out and get advice. So a lot of these businesses don't know how to do it on their own, and we would suggest to the government that they introduce, again, a voucher system similar to what they're doing in the dining space and the accommodation space, and have it for professional advice to enable people to, A, access capital to continue to survive, and B, to transform their businesses. Because the best businesses today, what we're seeing is they've embraced technology and they've become more digital.
Stay with me, Andrew. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Andrew Hunter, Chief Executive Officer of CPA Australia. So you've been talking to CPA Australia members in public practice. They're the ones working with small to medium-sized enterprises and individuals rather than corporations. What's the level of confidence that you're seeing and hearing about right now?
Well, It's mixed. Some industries are thriving, some industries are really challenging. But I think it is important to step back and understand what the government support packages are trying to achieve. So, plainly, we are in a crisis and everyone needs to contribute in the best way that they possibly can. And I think one of the impressive things that's come out of the crisis is everyone is doing what they can for the businesses and the people that are in need. And I think the way the government has approached this problem is the first thing they've done is they've encouraged the market to find a new equilibrium. So rather than the government just stepping in and solving the problem, they've said to the market, you find out the best possible solutions that you can, and then we will try and fill the gaps. So I think the banks have been tremendous in helping businesses. You can have a good conversation with your bank today. You can ring up and say, the lockdown's hurting me. I've got a good business. I'm a good payer. I need to reschedule a payment that's due. And the banks are being accommodating, which is terrific. I think landlords are being accommodating. So I referenced my favourite restaurant that I go to, and the tenant there, the guy who owns it, said to me that the landlord's been fantastic, and he hinted that they were paying about 1/3 of the rent that they ordinarily will, and that's fantastic.
That's great support.
And then the banks are being good with the landlord. So then the landlord, who, we know in Australia there's a love affair with property, and anyone who owns property's got leverage. So the landlord...
An unstoppable love affair, it seems.
It certainly is. But look, the banks are being good with the landlords. So they're saying to the landlords, yep, we know you're not getting all of your rent, so you can defer your payments. But the other one that's really impressed me, and I've had a bit of a career in small businesses and seeing what support they get, is suppliers have come to the table as well. So they're saying to businesses who go into lockdown, if you did place an order with us, we can put it on pause. So they're helping them by extending payment plans. So we're seeing a solution that is coming from the private sector. And having spent most of my career in the private sector, and I'm a bit of a free market person, I think the private sector first and foremost needs to find a new equilibrium. And I think the government's allowed that to happen. Then what the government's doing is it is doing enough to enable our businesses to survive. And this is a little bit controversial, but some people have been critical of government because they're not making businesses whole. So they're saying, if my turnover was $200,000 a year and it declines to zero for 2 weeks, you should give me $200,000. And the government's saying, no, we're only going to give you $30,000 because we're going to give you enough to get you through the crisis. And I think that is the right solution, because if the government made everyone whole, one, we would end up with an enormous debt that has to be paid back. But two, I think it promotes our moral hazard. We can't expect the government to bail us out of every single crisis, but what we should expect of our government is to enable us to get through a crisis, and that's what they're doing. I think the final point that I'd share with you in this area in terms of confidence is certainly in Victoria, businesses are conditioned to lockdowns. So what we've heard from our public practitioners is that the good business owners are building up cash reserves where they can, because they know that there are going to be other lockdowns. But the other thing is they have come to expect that during a lockdown, governments will be there to provide them with a support package that enables their business to get through the lockdown.
Can I turn now to the hopeful state of being in post-lockdown? Have you seen other trends emerging from different states around the country as they've emerged from lockdown and what we might learn from that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Western Australia, for example, is going well. They obviously have closed their borders very quickly to the rest of the country whenever there has been a lockdown. I think Tasmania generally is in the same camp. We are seeing some interesting challenges, though, in Western Australia, which are very similar to what they experienced during the mining boom. There are labour constraints. So the mining industry cannot get labour. Not only can it not get it from international markets, but it can't even go to other domestic markets. Yeah. So interestingly, there is a push on labour costs for businesses, which is interesting. Tasmania generally doing pretty well. Melbourne actually is doing... Look, it's tough. I don't want to create the impression that it's not difficult. But the real surprise for our public practitioners has been the lack of insolvency activity.
Oh, that's great news.
It is terrific news. And again, it's because the market has come and done what it needs to do, which is, the banks are stepping up, the landlords are stepping up, the suppliers that can afford to are doing their bit, and then the government is keeping businesses alive so that we can get through this. Look, I'm an optimist at heart, and I think Victoria we're doing incredibly well in a really, really difficult time. The ACT is an interesting place.
Always.
It always is an interesting place, but it's surviving well because government is there and government doesn't go away.
Yeah.
And
if anything, we've needed more of it.
Absolutely.
So, Andrew, just finally, what you're talking about there, I'm really encouraged by, because so often we get to talk about a market that is so strong on competing with each other, whereas what you've described is a situation where we're actually cooperating to help each other get through a really tough situation.
Look, it's a fantastic cultural shift that we've seen in Australia. So in my previous role, I was the CEO of an export credit agency of Australia called the Export Finance and Insurance Corporation. And one of our mandates was to support small businesses. And what I noticed back then was big business did not make it easy for small business. And just one example to share with you, I remember one of our small business clients picked up a big contract with one of Australia's big miners. And after they won the contract came to them physically, and it was 700 pages.
Oh, my God.
Now, that is not a good way for big business and small business to work together.
There's your induction kit.
That's just crazy. But what I'm seeing today, really, really impressive, is the big retailers. This was one example that was shared with us. The big retailers are saying to the people who are supplying them, if you're struggling at the moment, let us know. If you need to cancel an order, let us know. If you need us to pay you quicker, let us know. And that is it's a terrific response. And that's exactly what we need to see in Australia. I commend the governments, though, as well, for first and foremost letting the private sector try and solve the problems, because I do think the private sector is better at solving problems than the government. The government comes in at the end to fix the bits that can't be fixed in the private sector.
Andrew, that's a great note to leave it on, a really optimistic one. Thank you for your 5-point plan and for talking to Fear and Greed today.
Terrific. Thanks for having me on the show, Adam.
That was Andrew Hunter, Chief Executive Officer of CPA Australia. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join Sean Aylmer every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Adam Lang. Enjoy your day.